Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. This is Alex, and I'm here with Molly and Eric and Terry, and Tom Glenn has joined us because he's going to be our big guest speaker for the night. And if you have ever seen those pictures of the ISS crossing the moon or crossing the sun, with Tom took one of the ISS crossing in front of Mars, and it was a fantastic picture. He posted it on cloudy nights, and I said, "Hey, he's got to come tell you about this." I have done some of this. I have chased down the ISS in various situations, including with my dog, visually passing in front of Lyra, and it's really fun to see the solar panels and everything in your dog. You've got to really pull that scope just right. But it's also a lot of fun to try to take pictures of it. And you got to go hunting. And I can tell you, it's not easy to do. The group of buddies that I had that were trying to do this, we tried about 4 times before we managed to grab the picture of the moon and the ISS crossing in front of it. And then we were so happy about it, we were going to go out and do it again and again and again. We tried another 3 times and never were successful at it. But that's because we hadn't yet heard from Tom. And Tom knows how to do all this stuff. He's so good at it. By the time he's finished, tomorrow night, the next night, you go out there, you take your own picture of the ISS crossing in anyway. We'll hear more about that. I'm going to start sharing my screen here because I got to do a few things. And I'm going to share my entire screen. Boink. Share. And the first place I'm going to go is to the YouTube page itself. Hi, Alex. Alex is on the YouTube page. And if you have not yet looked at the comment section over here on the right-hand side, I want you to notice something. Jeff Weiss has pointed out that he has just become the 10,000th subscriber to our YouTube channel. Now, this is our YouTube channel. It's your YouTube channel. I mean, you guys use it as a little club meeting. I know that. And I'm really happy that you go ahead and do that. But he made the 10,000th, so I can quit asking for that for Christmas. Now, how are we going to honor Jeff? Well, we immediately thought that, hey, let's get him one of the T-shirts. And then we realized, oh, we don't have T-shirts for the Astro Imaging channel. So what we decided to do was we're going to give him a free year's membership in watching the channel. We figured that was the most economical thing we can do because it doesn't actually cost anything to watch the channel. So, Jeff, for the next year, feel free to watch this channel. Thank you very much for doing that. All right. Well, anyway, we're at 10,000. I don't know how that will change our life. We are considering, checking out the advertising. Maybe we got too much advertising going in there. Maybe, whatever. We don't know exactly what YouTube does to this once we get to 10,000, but we're not going to become a commercial station. We're going to become like NPR. Every once in a while we'll ask or something. But anyway, congratulations to Jeff for being the 10,000th, and to Adam and Toga and Molly and Terry and Eric and all the people through the last 7 years who've done so much to make this a resource for everybody. There'll be 50, 60 people watching tonight live and asking questions over here. And in the course of the next week, there'll be 600 or 800 people checking in to see whatever it is that Tom has to share with us tonight. We're really happy that we can bring you this kind of thing. So let's get back to some other work that we have to do. As you know, I always like to take a look at what's coming up in the next few weeks. We've got one more show in 2020. And although 2020 hasn't been exactly the greatest year, we're going to end it with one of our greatest presenters. Warren Keller is going to be here next week, and he's going to be talking about learning PixInsight the right way. So y'all come back next Sunday night on the 20th, and you can be with Warren, ask him questions. Ask him why he talks so slow on those videos. You can ask him whatever you like, okay? And you'll find that he doesn't really actually talk like that in real life. But anyway, then we're going to take a couple of weeks off because it's the holidays. And we all wish you all a good holiday. If you're in Hanukkah right now, whatever other holiday you're celebrating, happy holidays. And then Bob Buckheim's coming back on January 10th. And he's going to be talking about spectroscopy tell us a little bit about that. Kevin Francis has a fascinating story. He's gone from zero to quite an accomplishment in just 2 years now. And these stories are always encouraging to us. So I want to hear from Kevin. He's going to be talking about us on the 17th. And we all have, anybody that's been around astrophotography for a while remembers Chris Hendren. And Chris has won an iPod, or an APOD rather. He's won an APOD, and he's been selling us stuff for a long time. He helped design some of the stuff that he sells, and he's working with, I'll just tell you about it. He'll be here. And then Steve Hummel is going to be telling us about how to image sprites. We had a big, long discussion about that just a couple of weeks ago. We'll talk about more. Then we'll take time off for the Super Bowl, another one of the high holy days in America, and come back with Prima Luce Lab, Tom Bromwell, and David Rowe from Plane Wave Instruments, and Randolph Barron. Randolph Barron, I got to tell you, he's going to be talking about sketching, and I'm really excited about that. I met him the other day out at GMAR Scope Mountain, where my observatory is out in the desert. And when I found out that he was the guy that was these sketches from, I said, "Oh, and I know you. Hey, you got to tell us about how you do sketching." So he signed on to do that. We've got some other people scheduled, but we always need more scheduled. Okay, we always need more. You're out there. It's your organization. It's your club. You're willing to sit there and talk about, hey, what's your imaging like? How's it going? What's your weather like? Did you buy anything new? Okay, how about you want to contribute to it by telling us a little bit about something you can image? You hit the contact part here, and you tell us some information about yourself. Give us your email. We'll contact you, and we'll work out what you can do, when you can present and stuff like that. All you need is PowerPoint. You don't have to be the world's greatest imager. I've given presentations on this thing, and I'm certainly not the world's greatest imager. So please take part in that. But let's go back to home, because when you first sign on to the Astro Imaging channel, you'll see this big banner headline right there. And it says you go to Orion time. So you go up here and you can see Tim McCollum was one of the first people to submit his Orion. You can take an image of anything in Orion, any particular object, M42, M43, the Horsey, the Flame, M78, if you can figure out what it's supposed to be like, because M78 such like so amorphous. Anyway, take whatever you like, or take the whole thing. You get all the little loops up there, and Barnard's loop and all that other stuff. Anything related to Orion. It can be a movie or a still. It's got to be this apparition of it. Okay, you can't go back to 4 years ago when you took it before, and turn it in by February 7th. Either a JPEG, at least 1080 pixels on a side. We need it big enough so that when we present it in the movie we're going to make, it'll show up. And this is one of the reasons we had to go to this format instead of the Facebook format, because the Facebook format was just shrinking the images and we couldn't get that. If you got a movie, put the link to the movie in there and I'll go get it and bring it in. And all you got to do is click there to submit the file, and it goes into your email system. And that's all you got to do. And we look forward to all of you taking a picture of Orion sometime in the next couple of months and turning it in. And when we're all said and done with it, all we're really going to have is a little movie of Orion, kind of like we did with the comet a while back. Okay. We do expect you guys to take some pictures next, is it a week from tomorrow, of Jupiter and Saturn. It's only one picture. You can get them in one picture. All right. So everybody get out there, look over in the southwest, look for that one star up there, the Christmas star. It's the Christmas star. All right. Take its picture. If you can get it in a telescope, get the both of them together in a telescope. That's it. Okay. So that's for the announcing. And I think we're ready to go. So I am going to turn it back over to Tom. Tom, introduce yourself. Tell us what you're going to talk about and take it away, okay?
All right, great. So can everyone hear me?
Yeah,
all right.
Good.
So thanks, Alex, for inviting me to come give this presentation. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see.
Okay, you're presenting and you're
Okay.
on. Okay, you're good.
So the title of my talk is Mars and the ISS Imaging Transits of the International Space Station. But I'm going to cover more than just that one image. So I'm sort of going to give a general overview of space station imaging, particularly looking at transits of the space station across other bodies such as the sun, the moon, and the planets, several of which are shown in this collage of images here. As a way of sort of a general outline for the talk, I'm going to give a little introduction and background into who I am and how I started doing this sort of imaging. I'm going to tell the story about Mars transit image, and then I'm going to talk more generally about ISS transit imaging, including some technical considerations, orbital predictions, and preparations. Because really, getting an image like this, it's all about the preparation. So the entire image sequence, I mean, this here is 0.35 milliseconds, and the entire series was 0.4 seconds across the frame of the camera. So you put in many hours of preparation for, but these, it's going to kind of blend together in the overall story. So I'm going to talk about equipment things all throughout the talk, so this outline isn't so rigid. So I'm a research scientist, and my training is in biology. So I majored in biology at Duke University and earned my PhD in developmental biology at Stanford. And I currently work at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla, California. And so this image here on the left is actually taken from the old lab building that I worked in, student at Stanford, and shows some of the Stanford campus, as well as a moon rising above the campus. And so astronomy is a hobby of mine that I didn't really begin until recently. So I didn't own a telescope until 2015, but I'll show some examples of images I took without telescopes, which is, I think, a key point of mine, that you should make the most of what you have in terms of equipment. You may not even have dedicated equipment, but you can still do some interesting things. And currently I mostly do solar system imaging, planets and the moon predominantly, but also some space station imaging, obviously. So I guess what you could call my first astronomy image was back in 2012 with the transit of Venus. And it seems almost comical now to think about this, but I didn't even know this event was happening until the day of the event. I just wasn't paying attention. Heard some people in the lab talking about this, did a quick Google search and found out that it wasn't going to happen for over another century. So I thought I'd better try to capture this. So first off, a general warning, throughout the talk, there's going to be several images of the sun. Don't look at the sun, don't image the sun without knowing what you're doing. That disclaimer need not be said here, but nevertheless, I put it here for others that may watch the video. So on June 5th, 2012, this was my optical setup. It was a pair of cheap binoculars duct taped to a cheap tripod with a cereal box acting as a sunshade. And you get when you stay at a hotel enough times and you earn free points. And I think that, in fact, is the origin of these binoculars. My dad had stayed at a Hilton enough times and got some $50 binoculars. So I didn't worry about the duct tape ruining them, and I taped on here. And amazingly, I was shocked at what you could actually accomplish doing this. This is probably not news to anyone in this audience. I'm sure many of you did the same thing, and perhaps even better than this with real equipment. But you could see Venus, and amazingly, if you take this into Photoshop and adjust the levels, you can get something that almost looks like it's a real image and not taken off of a cereal box. But you can see Venus here, and actually some sunspots even. And the texture, which almost looks like solar cells, that's from whatever paper I was using to do this experiment. So the overall point is that you don't need much equipment to start imaging. I then used the same fine optical setup in South Carolina, which I actually grew up in South Carolina, so I was on a trip home. And this was on October 23rd, 2014, and there was a partial solar eclipse that you'd never know was happening unless you projected it onto a piece of paper like this, again, with the binoculars. And as you may know from looking at a map, South Carolina was on the path of the total solar eclipse in 2017. And in fact, where my family lives is near Greenville, South Carolina. So this was in fact on the path of totality, and we could just, I went home, and from our yard, this time I had a spotting scope with a solar filter on it, and I was holding my iPhone. So I had upgraded my optics, and was actually able to capture some decent images of the solar eclipse in 2017. So that was pretty cool. So that sort of ends the no telescope portion of the talk. And I had subsequently acquired a few telescopes. So it's interesting how few images I actually have of the telescopes. I had to search to find them. It's not something I typically photograph, but the first scope I got was actually this 4.5-inch Meade reflector. I got this secondhand from a friend of mine. And this scope is the type of scope you can still buy today, both packaged by Meade and Celestron. It's a 114 millimeter aperture, 910 millimeter focal length. At least at the time, it came with terrible eyepieces that you have to throw away, and it came a horrible mount. But nevertheless, I started with that and eventually bought a C925 Edge HD telescope. And then I had both of these, and so I could buy an adapter plate and actually mount the Meade on a reasonable mount. And so there's actually some images in this talk taken from this Meade telescope, even though it's, I think you can buy something like this today for $100 or something like that. And the secondary screws had stripped their housing, and so I had used duct tape once again with the duct tape, very useful. But this scope requires duct tape to collimate. And now, though, I don't use that scope anymore. I have a similar scope, so it's also a Newtonian, same focal length, but a 6-inch aperture, and it is shown here with a camera attached and also a solar filter. That picture was taken during the transit of Mercury, actually, but shown on the right is an image that I obtained of Saturn using this scope. And TPO is an off-brand or a rebranded GSO. So it's a GSO telescope that is sold by a company out here. The optics are reasonable. Actually, the thing only costs $200, and it's fairly amazing for a bargain. It does require a coma corrector. I use the Baader MPCC Mark III. If you're going to be using a wider sensor, but for planetary imaging, that wouldn't matter. So typically I use this scope for wider fields of view, such as the lunar eclipse here, or the transit of Mercury, which I mentioned the previous photo was of. So it's kind of amazing to me. So this transit of Mercury, I barely caught it. It was in the morning and there were clouds, and then they cleared up right at the end. In some ways, it's not that much better than my serial box Venus image, although clearly it looks a little more professional, I suppose you could call it. The primary telescope that I use for planets and the moon is the C925 Edge HD. And I have two cameras, an ASI 183 monochrome camera and an ASI 224 MC color camera. The ASI 224 I use for planetary imaging, and the 183 I use for lunar imaging and also some ISS imaging. Although actually the ASI 224 is probably even better for the ISS. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the image scale is 0.21 arc seconds per pixel at f10 with this camera, with the 183 on the C925. And so that's usually what I'm imaging at. It essentially is diffraction limited and performs very well. On the moon, the sensor is quite large, and you can get fairly high quality images while covering a large piece of terrain, and the detail is quite good. So here's another example of a lunar image. And as I said, I use the color camera, the ASI 224 on the planet. So this is sort of my background just over the last couple of years for how I got started solar system imaging. So then that brings us to the International Space Station, so shown here in an image taken from orbit by NASA. And it's a beautiful structure, very large, about the size of a football field, just a little over 100 meters in length, sort of as we're seeing it here in the long axis. And amazingly, you can capture a lot of detail from this, even with moderate aperture telescopes. And so shown here is a schematic of the orbit. One of the things I like about the ISS is it's an equal opportunity imaging target for most people on the Earth, because the orbit is inclined about 51.6 degrees, as you can see here. And so as it goes around the Earth and the Earth spins underneath it, you get nearly complete coverage of the globe. And in fact, anyone located between positive or minus 51 degrees latitude would potentially have a zenith pass, where you would get a favorable view of the spacecraft. So for ISS imaging, there's two main varieties. So you'd have close-ups and then also transits, and those could be one and the same. You could have a detailed transit, but they do have different methods involved. So the image on the left is one I took from my backyard a couple of years ago. I think October 2017 was this image. And so I used manual tracking. Typically, it's actually somewhat surprising, at least when people first learn it. I'd say the majority of ISS images are done with manual tracking. And that's because automated tracking is actually quite difficult. The spacecraft is moving very fast, up to a degree per second. And it's variable speed throughout the pass, and it's moving in both right ascension and declination. So it's challenging for any mount to keep up with, although there are mounts out there, high-end mounts, very expensive ones that can do it. And there's also programs, open source software programs that have been written by people to allow regular mounts to track, but it's kind of hit and miss. That isn't so easy to do. So I've done manual tracking. You just keep it in a red dot finder or a Telerad or something like that and hope for the best. And you can generally get a few frames out of, I think, 20,000 collected during a pass for this image. So transits are a bit different. The method is lying in wait. You focus and set your exposure on the body that is going to be transited, and then you start recording a video before the moment happens, and then you hope to catch the ISS flying across the screen. And the shutter speed depends on the angular velocity of the ISS at the time. And so we'll talk a bit about that. Is difficult with any method because this thing is moving at 3,600 arc seconds per second at zenith. And this also means that processing options are limited compared to other types of solar system imaging you may be familiar with, such as planetary or lunar, because the perspective angle is changing very quickly. Occasionally you can make small stacks of consecutive frames. So actually the image on the left here is a stack of a dozen consecutive frames that occupied a fraction of a second with the ASI 224 captured at 150 frames per second. This doesn't always work. Sometimes still images actually look better than any kind of stack. So you have to be careful with this method, but sometimes it works. This is an emission of 4 individual frames, so no stacking. These 4 frames occupy 36 seconds in real time. I took this just a few weeks ago. The range to the ISS was about 450 kilometers at the time. And so the cool thing about this image is you can actually see the Crew 1 Dragon that was launched by SpaceX and had just docked on the ISS a few days earlier. So shown here, you can see it in both of these frames. These are just individual examples. And then there's an actual image from on the ISS. So the vehicle is about 4 meters wide and 8 meters long. So this means the short axis is 2 arc seconds at about 420 kilometers, which would be the closest that you would get to the ISS if it was passing at zenith. So even though that's small, that 2 arc seconds is nowhere near the diffraction limit of most moderate aperture scopes. Even a 6-inch scope is capable of resolving that. The difficulty with ISS imaging is that it's moving so fast and you can't take advantage of frames stacking the way you can in planetary imaging. So you very rarely reach the diffraction limit. You can see a lot of structure here. So the radiator panels, which are often, but not always, the brightest part of the spacecraft, each one of those squares is about 3 meters wide. So that makes sense if we're saying that the Crew Dragon is about 4 meters wide, give or take, looks like a reasonable estimate. So it's kind of amazing to be able to go into your backyard and see several meter level detail on the spacecraft flying by at 7.4 kilometers per second. So that's sort of general imaging that you can do, and you don't have to wait. All you need is a pass. You don't have to wait on transit. But I'm primarily going to be talking about space station transits. And so shown here in the schematic, which is obviously not to scale, an idea of what's going on. So you have in this region here in between these lines, you can imagine an observer standing at each one of these lines would see the space station, if you follow it out, covering a portion of the moon. So the transit across the lunar disk would be visible within that spread of land, but not outside of it due to parallax. So if you then replace the moon with Mars, so again, this isn't to scale, although Mars is approximately the size that it would be relative to the moon in the previous image, nothing changes about the preparation here except that the area with which the transit is visible has shrunk to a very small piece of ground path. And so in fact, if a transit like this were happening at zenith, which it obviously with Mars located where it is now, this was not, but if it was at zenith, then the width of the ground path is approximately the physical dimensions of the ISS itself, so around 109 meters, depending on which angle or which dimension you're measuring on the spacecraft. So we're talking about very small stretches of land. So for any transit, the characteristics are determined by the altitude of the ISS above the local horizon. So this is 2 examples of solar transits that I took over the last couple of years. The one on the left occurring at 24 degrees elevation and the one on the right at 70 degrees elevation. So that several things you can appreciate. The lower elevation pass, you get more frames. I should say this was taken with the same telescope, same camera, same frame rate, everything the same. So you get more frames in the same amount of time, and that's because the apparent angular velocity of the spacecraft is much slower at lower elevation, and also the spacecraft is much smaller because it's actually farther away. So low elevation passes are undesirable for 2 reasons. One, the general nature of low elevation, we don't like it in imaging because you get more atmosphere to image through, so that's bad. But also the spacecraft itself is farther away. So these are sort of blown up images of single frames from these transits, and you can see the difference between a 24-degree elevation pass and a 70-degree elevation pass in terms of the detail that you can see in an individual frame. So why would you do this? Well, so I find it fun. It's also challenging, and you have the opportunity to capture something unique. Now, of course, fun comes with the disclaimer that it is not very relaxing. It can be quite frustrating and stressful, as I will try to convey in my description of the Mars image. But there is a certain something that is quite addicting about it. And the uncertainty of whether you're going to be able to pull it off definitely adds to, at least for me, the element of excitement. So you might wonder, don't you just have to be in the right place at the right time? And if so, isn't that easy, especially if you're recording video? And the answer to that is no, for several reasons. So the orbital predictions have up to 1 kilometer of error possible. We'll talk about this later. Although 100 meters to 500 meters is more common, the error that I've seen. And in addition to that, it can be surprisingly difficult to find a suitable location along the ground path, because you need the place that you're setting up to be legal. First of all, you can't trespass, and you need it to be safe, and you need it to be convenient. So there's a number of things that make it more difficult than you might imagine to set up just anywhere along the line. And then the list of technical problems that can pop up is very long. So this is the transit line for the Mars transit back on September 14th, plotted in Google Earth. So as many of you know, the website calsky.com, which was very useful, and in fact is what I used for the Mars transit, is no longer operational. So this map actually was produced later. I did this for this presentation using a different method, which I'll talk about a bit later in the talk. So suffice it to say that CalSky's absence is not a huge problem, at least for planning transit images, although it is an unfortunate loss of the website. So this is the general ground path. And so this is the map that was produced by CalSky. And so literally you just look at the map and see if you can find a place where you can set up. So what you might not know is here, this entire region is actually a military zone. Here's Miramar, which used to be a naval air station. Top Gun was filmed flying out of Miramar. It's now a Marine Corps air base. So all of this is off limits. These areas are, you can certainly here, if you go past this, you start to get into the desert. So there's a lot, and near the coast, there's a lot of fog sometimes. So you just have to pick a place on the map that you think might work. And so I zeroed in on this area near this lake up here where I found a park. It's called Jerebeck Park. And so you can see part of it here, purple, which is not showing up terribly well here. This is the transit line. And I'll talk more about the orbital predictions later. The annoying thing is this line will move. Not only does it have several hundred meters of potential inaccuracy built into it, but it will move as you approach the time of the event. So you can't really plan this too far in advance. And you may pick a perfect spot only to find that the transit line moves away from that spot. So this was the final map on CalSky, although actually I generated this map after the fact. So their purple line that they had drawn is not even where the line was at the time. So when I set up my location on the X here, this is where the center line was on that X. And the dotted line that I drew later is from measuring my image and estimating where I think the true center line would have been. And as I said, there can be several hundred meters of error in the prediction. And so in this case, the error only looked like it was maybe 50 meters at most, maybe just 35 meters. So it's pretty accurate. Now, in terms of planning, aside from the ground track, the greatest concern I had was weather, actually, which is always of concern. But especially in California, in August and September, we had some crazy weather. So this is an IR temp gauge in my backyard reading 168.8 degrees Fahrenheit on the ground. It was not that hot in the air, but it was about 110 ambient air temperature. And of course, astronomy was the least of people's worries at the time. So the West Coast was actually on fire. And so this image was taken by Chris Cassidy on board the ISS, actually. I think he's now back on Earth. Although I'm not sure about that. I have to check. But he was commanding officer of the International Space Station. And he took this image, which I think is an amazing image, showing the scope of the wildfires. Part of what's incredible here is the scope of this image. So for anyone that's familiar with the West Coast, we're kind of looking down the West Coast. If you can see my arrowhead here, this is Crater Lake, Oregon. And way up here is Point Reyes National Seashore, which I've gone hiking at before. And San Francisco, the bay is in here, hard to see. Here beneath the clouds, that's Pyramid Lake in Nevada desert. So anyway, the scope of the fires was wide. And the sky here was very orange. So this was the moon on September 5th. I've never seen it that red outside of a lunar eclipse before. And there was always a haze in the sky. In fact, several days before the transit, I looked up and I could only see the moon and Mars. So that's never a good sign when you have to be -2 magnitude to be seen in the night sky. But nevertheless, I hoped for the best. My timeline was I pulled an all-nighter because I couldn't sleep. I left the house at 3:20 in the morning, arrived on site at 3:50 a.m. The sprinkler system was on in the field. That was an unexpected potential nightmare, but fortunately, the area I wanted to set up looked like it had already been watered, so I just hoped that it wasn't going to come back on because that would have derailed everything. You could almost imagine having 10 seconds to go until the transit and then the sprinklers turn on, and ruin your equipment and your night. That'd be terrible. So I was set up and ready by about 4:30 a.m. There was a fire capture crash with 5 minutes to go, which I can tell you is near heart stopping. Although I rebooted just reloaded the program, got it up and running, and then ultimately started recording in time and had success at exactly 5:15:47 local time. And I packed up and went home. So it was a pretty surreal experience. This was the moon and Venus. I grabbed this after the fact because it just looked pretty to me. The moon actually saved me though, because my finder had been knocked loose on the scope and I was having trouble finding Mars on the sensor. So I used the moon to recenter the finder, which was nice. This is not a high quality video, but I did have an 8mm lens going. It actually plays slow, so hopefully it'll work. I can narrate as we go along. So what you're going to see is the ISS was actually in Earth's shadow to start, and only at about 40 seconds before the transit was it exiting Earth's shadow. And unlike in the planetarium software, you see it appear, in actuality, it's a gradual increase in brightness as it exits Earth's shadow and starts to hit the sun. So you can see it increasing in brightness as it approaches Mars, and it was supposed to surpass the brightness of Mars by the time of transit. So the little window on the bottom probably doesn't show up very well in the live feed, but that was a live video from the C925 scope. So I saw it flash across the screen. I knew that I hadn't been dropping any frames. The recording looked good. So I packed up and went home without even looking at the file until I got home, because I was feeling the adrenaline surge. I did not want to mess around with the computer. So I just went home and I was very confident that I had gotten it. But when I pulled up the frame, now these are linear files in a curves adjustment. They're quite dim. I was very happy with the result. You never know the timing of how the frame that corresponds to the closest approach is going to work out, but it was kind of remarkable how this one worked out. What I will say about space station imaging is, especially with transits, the difficult part is the planning and preparation and the execution. The processing, once you have the data, is quite simple because almost everything is presented as a single frame with very minimal processing. So I load all the individual frames into Photoshop. I have a slide coming up a little later to show how you can easily extract these frames, but use software called PIP. People are probably familiar from planetary imaging. And I save TIFF files, and you load them up. These are the raw files. I did a curve sketch just so you could see it more easily on the screen. And you change the blend mode to lighten, and it reveals the highest value pixel for each point, and that essentially unmasks the ISS in all the images, and that's basically it. Then you just do whatever black point and white point adjustment you want, and that's the final image. So this is the full field of view of my camera, so I didn't proper rotate this at all. So I decided on my region of interest beforehand, and this was all done in testing. So I'll have another slide on that in just a minute to explain how I oriented the camera. But this is an individual frame. This, again, it's 0.35 millisecond exposure. This was sort of the best photo of the marquee photo of the event, and I was very happy with it. So I actually didn't use Stellarium for this, but you could. So I used, again, CalSky gives you some orientation, and you could pull up star maps, but there's no point in discussing CalSky now because it's gone. So I just want to show what you could do with either Stellarium or a similar software. So now, of course, if you're projecting into the future, which you would be for planning, then the default setting for Stellarium is to download the current orbital elements for you. But I wanted to go back in time to make this slide. And so this, given the field of view, this is 6 seconds before transit. The ISS should be visible. It's not, but that's because Stellarium is using the current orbital elements. So you have to download them, and I'll show you where you can get those. But if you introduce or upload the orbital elements into Stellarium, then it appears as it should. And so if we hit play, we'll see if I animated this, but pretty darn accurate view of what's going to happen. And stellarium is useful, so it's not useful, or it's not as useful for generating a ground track, because although you can spot check a certain location to see if a transit is going to occur, it's very hard to know which direction to move in without a map. So it's not the way that I would use to search for a location, but it's useful for planning purposes. Of it is to gauge the angular velocity of the ISS. So CalSky used to give that value for you. In its absence, you can just call out 1 second intervals by clicking your time and then use the measuring tool. So this shows that it was 2,805 arc seconds per second that it was going to move. And so it's no coincidence that my shutter speed was 0.35 milliseconds, because that is 1 over 2,857 second. So I was willing to allow 1 arc second of motion blur. And in fact, you could probably get away with a little more, because the limiting factor here is mostly the distortion from single frames. But nevertheless, I didn't want to miss it, so I was going on the fast side. You can use stellarium for, and again, I used WinJupos, and I also used the JPL Solar System Simulator, but it all gives the same data. You just want a picture of what the planet looks like at the time. In the case of a planet like Jupiter or Saturn, the rings are obvious in the case of Saturn, and the cloud belts obvious on Jupiter to orient the planet. On Mars, you have multiple surface features that you can use, and I wanted to orient the planet so that the ISS would be coming from right to left across the long frame of the sensor, just to try to maximize, to get a panoramic shot. And so it's important, as I mentioned earlier, to perform dry runs with your camera settings before the event, because anyone that is experienced in lunar or planetary imaging knows that the capture software sometimes does not like a certain region of interest, and you'll start recording and it'll give you an error or a failure, and your heart will drop if you hit record with 30 seconds to go before the transit and you have failures. So this all has to be tested out ahead of time, so that when you set up in the field, you know exactly what settings you're going to use. So I should say that in an image like this, the frame rate determines the movement between the frames. So this camera was going relatively slowly because of the large field of view at 41 frames per second, which allowed 68 arc seconds of movement in between each ISS image. And the shutter speed freezes the movement in each individual image. So in this case, to about 1 arc second of motion blur. So I mention it because sometimes people get confused about the difference between frame rate and shutter speed. They're two completely different things. So shown in this animation, I'm never sure quite how the animation speed is going to translate, but it should be about 25% of the actual speed. The full speed file doesn't behave very well in these virtual meeting environments. And so at the end, I have a link. I have a YouTube site where I posted a lot of this data, and you can watch the full speed transit there. You can also do an animation like this one, where you stabilize the stack over the ISS itself, and then Mars just kind of whizzes by, which is kind of an interesting alternative perspective. I mentioned before that the website that I relied heavily on was calsky.com. If you go there now, this is what you get. It just says, "It is done," and that is unfortunate. So what do you do in its place? Well, for the moon and the sun, the answer is easy. You can go to transitfinder.com, shown here. And this, I've actually been using this for years. In some ways, it was an even more intuitive site than CalSky. You enter your latitude, longitude, elevation, your dates. I believe 240 kilometers is the largest search value you can use. And it gives you a list of everything that's going to be in your area. And you can see that at this particular, well, okay, I don't have anything entered here. I think I entered San Diego for my region here. And there's no transits from what I entered, but you can see that there are some nearby. And you can look on the map. obviously, unless you're on a boat, you're not going to be getting these out over the ocean. And some may be more convenient than others, but you will no doubt find some transits occurring near you for the moon and the sun. And I say that using the moon and the sun is a good way to practice for planets, but that's kind of even a ridiculous thing to say, because doing the moon and the sun, it's not really practice. It's a valid and fun imaging in its own right. So I would encourage you to check this website out and see if you can get the ISS passing in front of the sun or the moon. Here's a couple examples. This should be, I hope, displaying as an animation. In this case, this was not a mistake. I knew it was going to be a near miss because this was at my house. This was a couple years ago, and I knew that it was a low elevation pass and the ISS was going to be small. The moon was low in the sky. The seeing was bad. I didn't feel like traveling. So in this case, the space station was going to be illuminated, and so I knew that you would be able to see it in a near miss. Sorry, you may see a cat in a moment. I've got some cats on the prowl over here if a tail goes in front of the video. So I should say that in a case like this, where the spacecraft is illuminated, you don't need it to cross the planetary body or the sun or the moon to take a photo of it. So even something like this, I was perfectly happy with. But if the spacecraft is in Earth's shadow, then the only way to see it across the moon is in silhouette. So you see here, this was the field of view. So this is one of the images actually that was taken on my old Meade telescope that used the duct tape on the secondary. And I was using the ASI 224 for this. And the camera goes at a blazing 150 frames per second. And even though, so this actually occurred during a supermoon event in January of 2018, actually several hours before a lunar eclipse as well. But I went out with a friend of mine to Mount Laguna, the Cleveland National Forest, and we got this transit. We knew we were going to be close to the limb. That was kind of planned. I wanted it to go close to Tycho just because I thought that would be kind of cool. 600 arc seconds per second, but with 150 frames per second, you could stop it pretty well. And because it was occurring at zenith, or I think 74 degrees altitude, so if you do the trigonometry, practically at zenith in terms of correction distances, you can use the ISS almost as a measuring stick itself, 100 meters wide, although in this case I actually did measure the image and then did some trigonometry. So I would estimate I was 317 meters away from the end or the very edge of the transit line. And interestingly, if you look at the transit line and I knew where I was set up here, you can load this into Google Earth and measure it, and it comes out to 298.9 meters. So the estimate ends up being pretty close.
Tom, do you have time for a question? Ray was asking, could you tell us more about how to set up the shutter speed with relation to the frame rate when you were taking images with the ZW camera? What settings do you use and how do you determine the area versus frame rate?
Yeah, so the frame rate is largely going to be controlled by your region of interest. So if you look at, in this image, this is the entire frame of the ASI 224. It's a very small sensor camera to begin with. If you were to use a smaller region of interest, you could go even faster, but that almost never makes sense with the space station because you also want a field of view. And so 150 is as fast as it goes for this camera, and that also depends upon your USB 3 connection and your hard drive write speed. But 150 is the maximum, and I was getting that in this case.
But I guess the question is about shutter speed and frame rate. What's the relationship?
So anytime, so we're talking about sub-millisecond exposures, as I said, in almost every case. Sometimes you can do exposures as low as 2 milliseconds. We're talking about.
Tom, for some reason you're breaking up.
Oh. People hear me now?
You can just kill your video because it's coming in choppy because my internet's being weird anyway.
Okay, stop presenting or what?
Just turn off your webcam video. Yeah, that should help.
All right.
You're good to continue presenting.
If people can hear me. So when you adjust the shutter speed,
Yes.
as long as your shutter speed is faster than your frame rate, it's not going to change the frame rate. So 150 frames per second, that means you could expose as slow as 1/150 seconds, and you'd still get 150 frames per second. However, 1/150 seconds would be a very slow frame rate, because we're talking about everything shown here is under a millisecond, and a millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. So your frame rate is never going to change. You're never going to be, so in planetary imaging, you run into issues where you don't want to expose any faster than your frame rate because you're losing light. Not do millisecond exposure on Saturn. It would make no sense if you were only getting 50 frames a second on the planet. But in the space station, you absolutely have to expose fast because it's moving, and so you'll get motion blur. So you pick your shutter speed first based on how you want to stop the motion. And so if I go back to this slide, can people still see my slides?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay. So I knew that the space station is going to move 2,805 arc seconds in 1 second. So if you want to keep the motion blur to less than 1 arc second, you need to expose at least 1/2805 second, which is shown here, 1/2857th of a second is 0.35 millisecond, which is what I used. So I'm not setting any sort of firm rule here. People can experiment and find out what shutter speed works for them, but I can just tell you, if you're exposing at a slow shutter speed, you're going to get motion blur. And as I said on this, where is it? Hold on. This slide. Okay, so the shutter speed determines how much motion will occur in an individual exposure. You want that to be frozen. But then the frame rate determines how much motion you get here, and that's determined by the camera. I didn't choose 41 frames per second. That's as fast as my camera can go when using this region of interest. So that's just as good as it gets. The ASI 183. For the ASI 224, you can get 150 frames per second. Now, why didn't I use that camera in this circumstance? A number of reasons. When the field of view is much smaller, I wanted a wider shot. Also, I wanted to go with the monochrome sensor over the color in this case. There was a lot of smoke in the sky. The exposure was very poor because of that. So I chose to go with the ASI 183, but it comes at the expense of a slower frame rate. Answers the question, but you know, the frame rate and shutter speed are only related to the extent. So yeah, you can see this slide. It's actually so that's the full field of view. But anyway, we can talk about it more at the end if there's more questions. But that's sort of the logic that goes into that.
And there's another question from Chris. How many pixels of blur does that 1 arc second equate to?
In this imaging setup, it would be about 5. So as a percentage, it's rather small. So yeah, because we're at 0.21 arc seconds per pixel at this image scale. And so I would say that it's virtually undetectable. So the blur you see in this image, I don't even see motion blur here. I see noise from high gain. So you never can control the weather. And I was fortunate to get this shot. The one consequence of the smoke that was present in the sky was that my gain was higher than I had planned on using for this camera, but it is what it is. So there's an interplay there between, if you try to restrict motion blur too much, if you worried too much about that, you're going to expose for so short a period of time that your gain would be through the roof and you would have a really nasty image. So, you know, as I said, there are people that do manual tracked space station shots with, I hear 1 millisecond is a frequently used exposure time, and that seems to work. And that's largely because you're not diffraction limited anyway, and so a small amount of motion blur is sort of just undetectable. But yeah, it's something to think about.
So do you try to keep the gain down and then do the rest in processing, or is there some middle ground on gain?
Yeah, so you kind of, the exposure on this scenario was tricky. So I knew what the apparent magnitude of Mars was, and you can look up the predicted apparent magnitude of the space station. It's not as helpful as you might think, because apparent magnitude assumes a point source. And as you can see, the space station here, so the apparent magnitude of Mars at the time was about -2, and the predicted magnitude of the space station was -4. And so you look at this image, and that kind of makes sense. I mean, the space station is significantly brighter, but that -4 magnitude would assume that this is all condensed down into a star. And so the space station actually has several features that are brighter than other features. So I had determined beforehand that I wanted to expose Mars at 25% of the histogram. And so that was based on just prior imaging experience with both Mars and the space station, and some guessing. I figured that if Mars is occupying 25% of the available space and the space station comes through and is significantly brighter, I just hope that it's not so bright to saturate pixels. And it wasn't. So if we go back to so this raw, so I applied a curve stretch here on the screen, but not the histogram. So you can see the brightest points of the histogram are about 50%. So that means the space station, there was an extra stop. So this is a linear histogram. So there's an extra stop of exposure that I would have had, but I didn't want to overexpose it. But like I said, this is all guesswork. If you talk to people that image the space station, it's quite challenging sometimes to determine exposure setting, and it changes based on the parameters of the pass, as well as your telescope's focal ratio and your camera. So if you change any of those variables, you would kind of have to go back to the drawing board. So part of the reason why I chose this camera again over my other camera was that I had been using this one more recently and was very comfortable with the exposures.
And you can set the exposure just on Mars even before the space station arrives.
Absolutely. Right? That's exactly. So before the space station arrived, the histogram was sitting. So again, this is in Photoshop. In Fire Capture, you see the live histogram. It was registering right at 25%. So we were right here, and then the space station flies through, and we're up at 50%. So I was just estimating that if I kept it at 25%, I would hopefully not blow out and saturate the pixels, which we didn't in this case.
Oh, Chris also asked something. Have you tried doing motion interpolation on the image sequence?
No, I have not done anything like that.
Okay, well, I think that covers the questions. You want to
Okay.
Get back to your presentation?
Right. Okay, so I talked about how you can measure things in the image. Using Stellarium again, which I didn't used to use it very much, but it is very useful. So if you go back in time, and again, as I said before, you have to load the orbital element. So Stellarium is great for going back in time. Here's January 30th, 2018 at 23:50:48 local time. The space station is nowhere to be seen if you do that right now, but you have to download the historical orbital element corresponding to that exact period of time. And if you do that, then you see it come across in the prediction. And actually, this transit took 0.3 seconds along this chord line. So in order to even get this to register, you can't adjust the second by values of 1. You have to you hit the play button and then just be quick with the mouse to click it. So you can get this and plot out your transit line. The only reason I mentioned it is that you should expect some errors. So Stellarium is great, but even using the same orbital elements as my other prediction software that I used, this is the Stellarium line, and there's the measured line. So it's about a couple hundred meters of error. So this doesn't matter if you're setting up near the center line. And this is a common occurrence you see in solar and lunar transits of the ISS. People will note that the true line deviated a little bit. But in the case of a planet, that could be enough to have a near miss. So it's just something you have to keep in mind. And ultimately, though, as I'll mention at the end of the talk, there's not much you can do about improving orbital prediction. So it's just something to have to keep in mind. This image, so the other images that I showed were raw images. Of course, my field of view could not accommodate the whole moon. So I created a mosaic and then put the image of the space station back on in place. You know, I don't do as much of this type of compositing anymore, although as long as you're open and honest with what you've done, there's nothing, you know, there's nothing wrong with it. I just wanted a pretty image, and it was all from the same set of data. But you just have to be careful anytime you're doing compositing like this to make sure you're truly representing the actual event, since this is more like action photography. But I kind of like the way this looked, so I did this. I mentioned before that, so I'm capturing a video the same as you would, exactly the same as how you would capture for lunar or planetary imaging. The only difference is in my standard lunar and planetary imaging, I don't use PIP. I know some people use it for a variety of things, but so this was done by Chris Airy. It's actually a fantastic program. It just doesn't always find a way into my workflow for lunar and planetary. But one thing it excels at is pulling frames from a video file. The reason this video is red, I was using a red filter, a 610 pass filter on a color camera. And so the raw images, you have to debayer them or else you'll have the Bayer pattern. And when you debayer them, they're red, but then you just convert to grayscale at the final step. So that is important though, to debayer the image, and you take a red image and then change it at the end. You can set the limits here. So you just have to go through, you do have to find your image of the space station going across the moon in this case. I will say that for just freehand images of the space station with no transit, PIP has a feature where if you go into, I forget which option it is here, but they have a space station option where the whole purpose of the selection is to identify bright pixels on a black background. And so you can feed this a video of 20,000 frames and it'll pull out anything it thinks is the space station. And that's an easy way to collect your images, because otherwise it would be brutal to try to find the space station images. But PIP is excellent for that. So kind of the final part that I want to talk about in my talk is just what to do in the absence of Cal Sky for these planetary predictions. So I mentioned ISS Transit Finder for the sun and the moon, but that does not include planets. So interestingly enough, I came across a program that was, so I guess first I want to just provide by way of an example so that this works. I thought it was important to show that you can do it. So I used, this is software developed by Ed Marana that I'll talk about in just a minute. And this shows a projected Jupiter transit from just a few weeks ago on November 19th. And if you plug the location that you choose into, you could do Stellarium, you could do Heavens Above, as I'm showing here, you could do a lot of things. You can see on the star chart that it also, you can use these websites. So this line is the path of the ISS, and you can see that it's projected to pass Jupiter. So again, I said this for Stellarium, but it also applies for Heavens Above. Could you use this to predict the pass? Well, yes, but it would be sort of the hard way. You would have to identify a pass of the ISS, pull up your star chart. It will no doubt not be a transit, and then you'd have to randomly, or maybe using a little knowledge of geography, click around the map to change your location to try to find where it's going to be a transit. That would be very difficult to do. But if you have a map ahead of time, this is a great way to spot check the accuracy of it. So I did that using Ed's program and then Heavens Above to get this star chart. This is a real quick video of what happened. So you saw the moon and Saturn and Jupiter in the star chart. And so in just a few seconds, you should see the ISS coming up from the lower right. And this, I actually, of all things, I forgot the tripod head attachment on my camera. So I was sort of hand stabilizing this with one hand while fiddling with my other scope with my right hand. So hopefully people saw that video. With my C925 Edge HD, I had the same setup going with the ASI 183, and this time the altitude of the pass was much lower. We were under 30 degrees altitude, so you can see the ISS was moving slower. So actually, as a result, I exposed for a little longer. This was 0.7 milliseconds. So Jupiter looks overall pretty terrible because it's down in the soup of the atmosphere. This is not a great time of year to image Jupiter. The ISS also is much farther away, not as much details to see at this altitude, but it was still, I was happy with the result. You can even see 3 of the Galilean moons. Callisto was actually just coming off of the disk of Jupiter itself. It had been transiting the planet, although it's occulted by the ISS now. It would actually be buried under there. So I have a quick video. The full speed probably won't play very well over the this meeting environment, but I have, after this repeat here, I have just a frame by frame, a 10% speed animation that shows the spacecraft coming in and passing Jupiter. And then these are 4 individual frames at the point of closest approach. So you can see in this case, just incredibly high noise, but nevertheless, if you reduce the size of the final image, it was still a fun image to do, and important for me to just test the accuracy of an alternative prediction program to CalSky. So that was successful. So what I can tell you about this is that you should visit Ed Morana's website. The link is at the bottom of this page. He has a Java app, which is what I used. Now, I actually communicated with Ed by email, and he said he's not planning on doing any updates to the Java app, but he does have an Android app that he is planning on updating. I haven't used that app yet, but obviously this one worked. It's not as, it doesn't have the bells and whistles of CalSky, and it's not an interactive website the way CalSky was, but it outputs text files and KML files that you can manually upload into Google Maps to get your map. And I also recommend downloading the digital elevation terrain data and geoid data, and I'll let you read Ed's website for more of a description on that. The only bug I found in the software is that the reported path width for planetary transits is not accurate. It gives you a value of several kilometers, when in reality it would be 100 to maybe 300 meters, depending on the parameters of the pass. And that's a known bug in the software. He said he's planning on updating that in the Android app, but it is completely inconsequential for planetary transit imaging, because you should not even be worried about a path width. You need to be where you think the center line is. So for the sake of time, I'm not really going to spend much on talking about orbital elements, other than to say that you can read about orbital state vectors and how satellite is done. But ultimately, the source of the data, there's 2 main sources. You can go to spaceflight.nasa.gov. CalSky used to do this automatically. Ed's program also does it automatically, but you can also configure it manually, which is kind of interesting. I'll briefly describe that in the final few slides. One reason I would advise you to go to spaceflight.nasa.gov and find the current ISS trajectory is, within any given ephemeris period, there's going to be this section called Maneuvers Contained. And this will list any planned rocket burns to boost the altitude of the ISS. So if they're all zeros, I don't know why they're listing them, because there's nothing planned. But you see here where there's numbers, 1.8, -1.1, 0.2, those are the change in velocity in feet per second expected after a burn of this amount of time. And so this is done to maintain the orbit. So the reason I mention this is, try not to image immediately after a rocket burn until you see the orbital elements stabilized, because this introduces an extra degree of uncertainty into the calculation. For those interested in raw data, NASA provides in several different inertial frames almost anything you could be interested in, just out of interest if people want to know. So x dot, y dot, and z dot give the instantaneous component velocity vectors in the x, y, and z axis. If you take the square root of the sum of the squares of these, according to the Pythagorean theorem, you get the instantaneous velocity of the ISS, which always comes out, if you test this, to be 7.66 kilometers per second with respect to the inertial frame. So that pretty much is done for you if you use Ed's program and click download NASA TLE. You can also go to spacetrack.org. I mention this because this is maintained by it's the publication, it's where the US government, the military publishes orbital elements. So they're typically referred to as the NORAD element set. So you can see here, NORAD catalog ID. So NORAD tracks thousands of satellites and makes available all this data for non-classified satellites to promote safety in spaceflight. And if you're a satellite operator, this helps you in a very inexpensive way monitor the position of your satellite, because you don't need live expensive tracking data. You can just use these numbers. In Ed's program, you can load, so the NORAD element set is updated every few hours, and this leads to a scenario where you can see the ground line, the ground path moving with very high frequency. So this is a zoomed in Google map showing exactly where the Jupiter image. So here's the take home here is that you can beat your head against the table, but at the end of the day, you're also going to have to rely on a little bit of luck, because these lines represent the final approximately 36 hours of data before the event. So NASA only updated their website one time in this time period, but NORAD was coming in every few hours with an update. And each time you plot the line, you see a little difference here. So you can see there's a 0.31 miles separating the two extremes here, and that comes out to around 500 meters, which is sizable. So it's hard to know what to make of this, because really it's at the level of error in the orbital elements themselves. So I just picked a spot in the center. I said, okay, let's just go here. I'll just set up here. There's a nice road. This is kind of a dream location. There's a Walker Canyon trailhead. You could park here if you wanted to, but you could drive down here. However, I showed up on site and I had no way of knowing that this road was closed. So I drove right here, and there's a concrete barrier in this entire stretch of road you can't drive on right now. So I'm, okay, great. So I actually spent about 10 minutes driving around. I went south here, across the interstate again, went off the map to see if I could find something to the south, and I couldn't. It was all private property, no trespassing. So I said, you know what, we're just going to go back. Let's just hope that the error is working in my favor. And I set up right here, and sure enough, it was good enough to get the ISS on Jupiter. So sometimes you just have to be lucky. And if I had set up where I wanted to, I think my preliminary calculations indicate it would have been a near miss. It was still a cool image. I would have gotten it, but it wouldn't have touched the planetary disk. So this is an example of things that you can't control. The final slides, so I know we're getting a little long on time here, but I would definitely recommend downloading the digital elevation data, and I'll refer you to Ed's website on how to do that. Although I will caution you that the links to the USGS site no longer work, so you do have to do a little bit of Google searching to find the proper map. But if you plot the projected transit line both with and without DEM, see as soon as you start to add any elevation into the picture, you get significant deviations. And it's on the order of, as shown here, 352 meters. So it can be significant. And in some cases, it's easy enough to say, oh, well, what if we just pick setting up in a location where there's a lot of terrain? Well, depending on where you live, that may not be possible. So I would definitely recommend inserting this into the equation. If you read about how NASA predicts ground paths of solar eclipses, which of course have been predicted for hundreds of years, but they're always updating their methods. And so currently they use digital elevation data for both the Earth and the lunar limb, and still they have about a 100-meter potential inaccuracy on the extreme ends. So it's a tricky business calculating precise ground paths over varied topography. So given the uncertainties here, there's no reason not to add this. So that's my final slide. Thanks for listening. I have a couple ways that you could contact me. So on Instagram and Twitter, I'm at Thomas D. Glenn. Although I'll say if you go there, you'll be underwhelmed by the accounts, because I'm sort of behind the curve on social media, haven't had a lot of time. So I only just started accounts. I have some images on Flickr at tglenn174. That started mostly as a way to share some of the larger lunar images that I take. although it's not a comprehensive list of everything. And so also here's the link to the YouTube Mars video. So I have a few videos on YouTube, but again, not many. So that's it. So let me, I can stop the screen share and bring back my camera. Okay, so sorry for the audio problems or video. Hopefully that came through okay in the end. But
Yeah, I think the audio came through fine. I think that the problems were on our end, not yours. By the way, for a little moment of humor, Chris brought up that in a couple weeks, I guess there'll be the orbital elements for Santa, right?
oh yeah,
You have any plans to image Santa?
you know, NORAD does track him, so I guess I'll have to look. We'll have to see, yeah, which software to use to try to get him crossing which body. But yep.
And do you have an Astrobin account? Do you post any images on Astrobin?
No, actually, you know what? I created an account, but it was just a view, so I haven't. So I am on there, but it was just a free account, and I didn't load. Time is a limiting thing, so I'm really behind on. I would like to actually make a website someday, but I don't. Haven't had the time for that. I'll say that I do post somewhat frequently on Cloudy Nights under my own name, so I'm not hard to find there. Things on Astrobin one of these days. But
by the way, there were a lot of really nice comments and from our YouTube watchers, and I'll say personally that was a fascinating presentation, and it either makes me want to do it or not do it depending on.
Well, yeah, no, I certainly hope people enjoyed it. One of the these virtual meetings, of course. So the pro is that people far apart can get together and have events like this. The con is, as someone who is used to giving presentations in my day job, at least pre-COVID, to groups, you feed off the audience and you interact with the audience, and you never have to worry about if your slide isn't showing properly because you can get. So it is a little weird to sort of talk for an hour into a screen, but I do hope that people were able to get the gist of it and they enjoyed it. So.
Yeah, there's
the videos actually played pretty well, I think. For some reason, your webcam streams were being weird on my computer, but the videos from your PowerPoint, I think, worked like they.
Okay,
that
cool.
was that.
A question came up. Do you try to track or look at transits of any other satellites besides the ISS?
But you absolutely could. So on the software that I mentioned from Ed, you can upload your own orbital elements, and so you can just go to the spacetrack.org website and look up any satellite you want and get the orbital elements, and then put them in its program, and it would treat it just like the ISS. All of the information. It's actually contained in 2 lines. So it's a TLE, a 2-line element. So just a 2-line text file has all the orbital elements that software needs. The way it works, it's essentially a ballistics calculator that makes assumptions about the decay of the orbit over a short period of time, and they tend to be valid over a very short period of time, but they have to be updated. So the reason that the trajectories are off by a little bit is not really because of the maneuver events. So a lot of people think that they missed it or they're off. You hear a lot of stories about a near miss of a planet, like you'll set up here and then you're on the line that Cal Sky predicted and it goes right by. That generally doesn't have anything to do with the rocket burns. It just has to do with the fact that the ballistics calculation makes assumptions that aren't always 100% true about the decay of the orbit. There's also errors just embedded into the measurements themselves. Literally, you load up any TLE you want, but if you want it to be accurate, it to be a satellite that is updated frequently, like nearly daily updates for the orbital elements, and also to get any kind of image out of it, it would need to be fairly big. So the ISS is the obvious, the largest one. You can do Hubble. Hubble is much smaller and not nearly as bright, and also is much lower in the sky. It doesn't have a huge inclination. The ISS is very popular for a lot of reasons. Human connection. There's people on board. 51-degree orbital inclination. Almost anyone on the planet can see it. In fact, I think anyone could see it. I mean, you could be in Bear, Alaska. I'm sure it would pop up still. So,
Anything else besides Hubble and ISS which will show any structure at all?
you know, I'm thinking there have been a few. There was one of the Chinese space stations that I don't know if it's still like what its status is now, but I recall several images from a few, you know, possibly Thierry Legault had a few images of, and some other people had, you know, images of other things transiting the sun. You know, I would say that, yeah, if you get something to transit the sun, since it's in silhouette, you may be able to see something. But in terms of structure, it would be difficult. Most satellites will be so small that if you did see them, if they're in silhouette, they'd be a small dark spot with no real structure. But you know, I'd have to refer you to other, you know, maybe do what are the largest satellites currently in orbit. I know that if you're looking for illuminated satellites, you can see tons of satellites, although most of them, if they crossed the disk of the moon, you'd never know it because they're just not bright enough. The moon would overpower them. The ISS is somewhat unique in that the surface brightness becomes brighter than the moon during a transit. So.
I've been
Alex?
watching along, following along. Chris asks if you've tried catching any of the Starlink deployments.
Company deployments, I got a bunch of them in a somewhat annoying way in one of my Comet Neowise images. I should say I don't do much deep sky imaging, but I did take a few Comet images back over the summer and was amazed that in a several minute period, I think there were 13 or something Starlink satellites that came from the field of view, but I haven't intentionally imaged them.
Okay. Yeah, I think we've got all the questions up there. And you did a great job. I having done this, and who was it that Jeff says that it sounds awfully complicated? Actually, while describing it all may sound a little complicated, the only really complicated part of getting a basic image is being in the right place and making sure that you start your camera and frames. It's that getting in the right place that counts. It's kind of like hunting. Not that I've ever gone hunting, but the whole concept of what you need to go hunting is not all that complicated. It's just make sure they're at the right time, right place, and you take the picture right, whatever it is. So
I would say that for the sun and the moon, because even given the variability in the orbital predictions, it's never going to be enough to where it's going to knock you completely off. And if you're aiming for the center, so even if you had a 1 kilometer discrepancy, which is larger than I've personally encountered, I've seen about 500 meters. 1 kilometer was still line of solar or lunar transit, you would still be in the transit zone, even with 1 kilometer error. And you could even do the camera lens. So your exact settings would depend on whether, if it's a solar transit, of course, you need a solar filter. If it's a lunar transit, if it's illuminated, which the ISS Transit Finder website makes it easy for you, it will tell you if it's illuminated, then you can even do a wide field of view. You could use a 200 millimeter telephoto lens, and just the moon might occupy only a small region, and then you have black space all around you, but you'll see the ISS come right across. In fact, I've done it that way. So there's really not much technical gear that you need to do some of that basics. Where it gets harder is if you're trying to resolve smaller details. And then, as I said in the beginning, the only thing that makes planetary transits more difficult is the narrow window. So it's logistically, the most challenging thing is to look at a map on Google Maps and try to find out where are you going to set up that you're not trespassing and that you're not in the middle of a school in the middle of the day where they don't want you to be. And these days with COVID, it doesn't make it any easier because certain areas close and they don't want people maybe setting up telescopes looking strange in the middle of the day doing it. But yeah, it's more of a logistical problem. But as far as the capture itself, if you're recording and you're not having a technical malfunction, then you're going to get something. Now, it may not be as beautiful as you hope for, but you'll get something if your camera is running at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, what knocked my socks off about your picture of Mars is really tiny compared to the moon. And I knew the difficulties I had of getting my moon shot was not technical photography problems. I mean, you focus on the moon and ISS is going to be focused at the same focal position. And you're kind of given what it is that you can take pictures of, a frame rate and all that other stuff. So take your pictures, just there's lots of places you can screw this up. One guy had a DSLR, he got it all ready, he had it all focused and everything else like that, and it went to sleep, as DSLRs will do. Okay, another guy waited until it was real close and then he started it, but he didn't realize that the thing had already gone by. The ISS had already gone by. You start 5 seconds early and you just collect a whole lot of stuff you don't need. And there it comes across. And
then there's a problem that if you start too early, like the people that have done it with DSLRs, you fill up your buffer and all of a sudden it lags right at when you don't need to lag it. So so you got some of those things will screw you up, but I think that any rookie who wants to try this is you just figure out where it crosses the moon when the moon is kind of high up and take it from there. Yeah. So the only thing that makes planetary transits difficult, aside from the logistics of the narrow ground path, is that now you don't have Cal Sky. So the software that I've used and described clearly works, and it's great. And I like that I can manually enter orbital elements, and it's kind of a nerd's paradise of if you want to dive into the raw data, and it's great. More effort to do. So it's not a one-stop shop like Cal Sky was. But for the sun and the moon, you have that in transitfinder.com. So I would definitely recommend anyone that's interested, go right now to transitfinder.com, enter your location. You will be guaranteed, set the time window for a month. You'll see something. It may not be convenient for you. You may not want to travel to it, but you'll find something. And so if you periodically scan that website throughout the year, you almost certainly will get something. I guess another question that comes up occasionally is, can I image from my house? Yeah, if you're willing to accept maybe 1 to 2 events per year, and then you have to have the weather good and be convenient with your schedule at those times. So in practice, I'd say it's been about 3 years since I've been doing transit imaging, almost 3 years. I've had 2 images from my house. One that was a near miss of the moon, and the other was an actual solar transit from my house. You get maybe 1 to 2 a year if you're lucky, and in practice, it would probably be 1 to 2 every couple of years. But if you travel, you'll get plenty of them. So,
but you can still, you can image the space station. It doesn't have to transit anything.
Correct.
It might even go past a star or.
If you want to just image the space station in general, NASA has a website, Spot the Station, which will predict passes. Like Heavens Above, you enter your location and it'll give you the passes for about the next 2 weeks. And the things to look out for are, you would like a pass that has high elevation. So there's a column that will give you maximum elevation. In fact, I might as well just, I can just go back to that slide real quick.
We see transits from my back deck all the time, and some of them are 2 or 3 minutes long, and I'm not sure I'd want to image them, but they're right there and they're fairly high elevation.
If you go to heavensabove.com, the website is right here. Enter your location.
Are you sharing?
Oh.
Yes, you're sharing.
I was. Am I not?
Okay, first off, stop there. Stop there. Go back to that slide you just had. With your mailing address. Oh, maybe you are there.
Wait.
Go to your contact page.
Okay.
Because somebody has just asked a question about your contact page. There. Okay.
Okay.
So you can get them on Flickr, Thomas, and Twitter and Instagram. Okay.
I don't. So, and also I didn't put it on here, but if you're ever on Cloudy Nights, so
Go to Cloud Nights.
I post under my own name. So the only reason I didn't put my email address in this presentation, not because I don't want people to email me, but because there's at least a small filter on, so you can get my email if you contact me through one of these other methods, or message me on the Cloudy Nights forum. Right now I get so much spam just from other stuff that your email might even be lost if you didn't use one of these other methods. So I apologize if you have to go through an additional step here to find me, but
That's how I found Tom originally. I just was looking at his picture on Cloudy Nights, and I said, "Oops, contact him directly right there." Okay, now you were going to show us. Was it Heavens Above?
yeah. So let's see. So if you go to Heavens Above and your location, click on ISS passes, it gives you, I can't remember if it's 10 days or 2 weeks, but it gives you a list. And then if you click on one, it gives you can find this map. So the things to look out for are, I don't know if you can read the text here, but there's a column that says altitude. And so then there's another, you can see this one says 69 degrees. So that's pretty good. So obviously 90 would be zenith. Anything above 60 degrees and the ISS is getting close enough to you that the imaging will be pretty good. Below 60 degrees, the details start to drop off. But you can do this from your backyard. You don't care if it transits Jupiter or Saturn from your backyard unless that's what you're hunting for. But if you just want the space station, like for example, one of the early images that I showed here. So this image, and again, this is a collection of, in this case, I was able to stack successive images, but you don't have to do that. It brings the noise down a little, but the individual images looked similar to this. This was from my backyard. The altitude here would be degrees, so basically zenith. The range is about 425 kilometers, which is about as close as you can get. So yeah, you can just look for these passes and set up your scope. And this was manual tracking, just trying to keep it in the middle of a red dot finder. And as I said, there were only a couple hundred, I think maybe 500 frames out of 20,000 that actually contained the spacecraft. And of those 500 frames, most were garbage. So most don't look good at all. But you find a few that, just lucky imaging, you get a few that look decent. So anyone can do that, for sure, even without, you just have to.
I've had more luck hand tracking than like using the controller and looking through the, than I have trying to get because my Paramount will track it, but my pointing model is never quite good enough to get it on target. So I've had better luck in tracking it.
Yeah, you hear that a lot from people that sometimes the tracking software, they'll give it a try, it looks like it's not working, and so they just disable the clutches on the scope and manually do it. So that's what I did. That's why, in fact, it's somewhat awkward to use an equatorial mount, but that's what I do. Again, this is my scope. So this image here was actually taken, the backdrop here, was near Lake Elsinore, California. This was at the site of the Jupiter transit. So after the Jupiter transit occurred, I put down the camera that I was also kind of hand holding, unfortunately, because I forgot, I was sort of balancing it. I forgot my tripod head attachment. I put it down, careful not to drop it, because I was pretty excited when Jupiter. And then I immediately loosened the clutches on this equatorial mount, and so you can see the red dot finder here. It's not a very good one. I should upgrade this. It's real annoying to use, and yeah, you have to get down under this thing, and it's pretty awkward. So people have a lot of success doing this with Dobsonian mounts. That's probably one of the more popular ISS imaging scopes because it's more convenient to manually track, since the Dobsonian is really designed for manual track.
Okay, I think we got all the questions. I think we got everything. Is there anything else you need to tell us, Tom? Okay, and we're gonna be calling it a night here. I want to thank Molly for getting everything worked out technically with the streaming and everything. It is a lot of fun.
I did everything right. I'm so excited. I didn't mess up this week.
Okay, thanks, Molly, and we'll be back next week with Warren, and he's going to teach us about how to learn PixInsight well, learning PixInsight well. So Larry up there asked if it's worthwhile imaging Jupiter and Saturn. You know, you probably will not get the world's best pictures of Jupiter and Saturn because, as Larry points out, it's kind of low. And we were talking about this before the show started. But you know, if you can get the disk and get the ring of Saturn, and you can get some stripes across Jupiter, and they're in the same darn frame, you're going to have your picture to look at. I'm not sure anybody's going to have a really good location to get Jupiter and Saturn together. And once a week from Monday. But certainly take a shot. I mean, worst comes to worst. You know,
we're going to be around for the next conjunction, are we?
Yeah, right. I don't know. I don't know.
I don't think I'm going to be around. I don't know.
Demographics we were reading earlier. I think some of us. We got an old group. We need more young people here, and we need more women watching the Astro Imaging Channel. So bring some women along to watch the Astro Imaging Channel, and bring some young people along to watch the Astro Imaging Channel. We do the analytics on these things.
I'll wait program. You can hang with it, like.
Sure.
Okay, we're gonna say good night. Molly, you're in charge. Take us out.
All righty. Good night, all.
Bye.